Hello and welcome to Global Business Report on the Arise News Channel. I'm Ni Uiloa, coming to you from Nigeria's commercial capital, Lagos. And over the next 60 minutes, we bring you the top economic and corporate stories from Africa and from across the globe, including in the European elections. Brexit party set to come out top as France, Marine Le Pen, beat Macron hands down. Plus, a merger becoming a reality between two main automobiles, Fiat and Chrysler. Then, troubled state power utility Eskom is in search of a new CEO who will brace out for the hot seat. And spotlight on the Nigerian economy and MTN listing controversy. Stay with us for details. Good to have you. As Nigerians hold their breath to see the new cabinet unveiled by President Muhammadu Buhari, political pundits and economic analysts say issues of political expediency, a need for exclusiveness and compensation for supporters may largely shape size and appointment. Meanwhile, the economy continues its sluggish journey of recovery as investors watch for change, even as operatives of the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission (EFCC) on Friday raided the MTN Nigeria head office in Falomo, Ikoyi, Lagos, shutting down all activities in that complex. Opeyemi Agbaje, the CEO, RTC Advisory Services Limited, is with us in the studio to help us unravel some of these issues. It's good to have you and good morning.
Thank you very much.
Welcome.
Good morning.
Now, let's take a look at the first quarter 2019 GDP results and the economy. What do you make of it?
Well, you described it already as sluggish recovery, and that's what it is. It's recovery. That's the good news. We're not in recession. Q1 2.01% growth was lower than Q4 2018. Is marginally better than Q1 2018, which was 1.89. So it's not what we need. We grow population, as most people should know by now, we grow population between 2.5, 2.4, and 3%. And so growing the economy just around the same or lower, as we've been doing in the last 3 years, is hardly the way to reduce poverty, to grow the economy, to reduce unemployment, and so on. And it has to be clear that there must be structural factors at work in Nigeria's sluggish growth. So we have to deal with some structural reforms. We can't just hope that oil prices or even our non-oil economy is going at around 2%. And the oil sector is back in recession, has been for some quarters. So there's something wrong. And in this second Buhari term, we have to discover what that thing is.
Yeah. And it's equally a little bit disheartening. The IMF projection itself is still hovering around the 2% range as well. So a grim reality there, as it were. Very good. Now, what are analysts and investors expecting on the president's second term?
Well, the hope, I guess, after the elections was that we would have a more private sector-driven economic strategy. An economic strategy more focused on investment rather than borrowing. I think the key deficiency in the Nigerian economy since 2015 is that we have insufficient levels of investment, both foreign direct investment and even domestic investment.
Well, why do you think that is?
I think you have to watch, and I'll at some point relate that to your MTN story as well. You have to watch what the signals from government communicate as our preferred economic strategy.
All right.
It looks like a strategy that prefers government control of the economy, that is somewhat suspicious of private investment, including foreign direct investment, that doesn't so much favor deregulation and markets and private capital and all of that. That's what you can deduce from the totality of policy. That's not what policy says, and that's not what the Economic Recovery and Growth Plan, for instance, says. It actually says the opposite. It says we're going to rely on private sector. The private sector will be the driver of growth. We're going to deregulate markets. We're going to allow the markets to work. And those are the express statements
so
in the
it's one thing to
ERGP.
make those comments, but if you're not providing the enabling environment for
And if it's not the action that investors see. Yeah. So for instance, I mean, if your strategy is to encourage private markets, private capital, deregulation, it doesn't reflect in our attitude towards the downstream petroleum sector. It doesn't reflect in our tariffs in the electricity sector. It doesn't reflect in our attitude towards currency and exchange rates. And surely it doesn't reflect in our treatment of perhaps the country's largest foreign direct investment in the last decade, MTN.
Yeah. Talking about
so investors look at your actions.
Yeah.
Not your words.
Indeed, you have to practice what you speak, what you preach, as it were. But this has been happening over time. We've been talking about all these issues, and you'd expect that. Look, you can't keep doing the same thing over and over again. You're getting the same results. You'd expect a more radical, channel of operation here.
That was the hope. That we had tried one approach for essentially for 4 years. Yes. I mean, the government's policy has taken that
even
track.
Before 4 years. I'm talking about like 10, 15 years ago.
Absolutely. But I am almost sure that we're about to continue with the same strategy. Okay. So essentially, we're waiting to see the team that the president appoints, but he has made one critical appointment, or the appointment, central bank.
All right.
And that suggests status quo. That suggests an endorsement of the policy approach, at least on the monetary policy side, for the last 4 years, or 5 years that MFLA has been there. So the signs do not suggest that we're about to abandon our policy preferences of the recent times and change. And then oil prices modestly higher than our 2019 budget projection of $60 per barrel. So I'm not sure I see a very great impetus for change. I see, though, that if you look at the economic data, you should want to change. Our fiscal situation is not so good. We're servicing current debts with 66% of revenues or more. So we clearly need some inflows of investment to create new liquidity, new growth around the economy.
Very good.
The GDP figures, which we've alluded to a little bit for Q1, also suggests, except something radical changes, a long-term growth hovering around 2.5%. The IMF says it's 2.1. The World Bank says 2.2. The Nigerian government says anywhere between 2.4 and 3%. That's not what we need. We need growth around 7%. I think we can easily do growth around 10%. And that's the kind of level of economic growth that can begin to make an impact on poverty figures, on unemployment figures, and on corporate profitability and the growth of the middle class. So I think policy needs to be a little bit more radical. It needs to be pro-growth, aggressively pro-growth. It needs to agree to seek capital from anywhere in the world, not borrowings this time because of our fiscal situation, but private capital that is dead, committed to long-term growth of the Nigerian economy.
Very good. Obviously, you've just answered you've alluded to the fact that the CBN government likely also said the economy will grow at about 2.1% in 2019. So let's go to the issue of attracting investors here. It is said that this is critical to any economic recovery. Many observers cannot understand why MTN is at odds with regulators here. So are we missing something in this regard? And, it's always the issue with MTN, which is a classic example here. So
I think if you run MTN, you probably now need a juju man to advise you on what to
say, as it were. Okay.
Because it's mysterious, actually. Like I said, if your strategy is to attract investment, you can't, in effect, declare what appears to any observer as a war against your biggest regional investor at the bank. And your best case study, case study, for 10 years, we were actually selling the MTN case to the rest of the investment world outside Nigeria. Look at MTN, see how much they invested, see the returns, see the growth. That was our case study for investing in Nigeria. Yes, there are things the company has done wrong,
yes,
I suspect.
I was going to allude to that.
Yeah,
yes,
they may have become arrogant, they may become overconfident. People tend to get away with a lot in Nigeria. But it's now becoming like a pattern of behavior. And certainly the more recent allegations against MTN.
With the listing at the stock exchange?
Well, okay, let's take that in a minute. But the issues around taxes and all of those other recent fines have lacked credibility. And have seemed either irrational or opportunistic. With the listing issues, I think that's a little bit more complicated. My best view, having spoken with a few of the people in the investment guidelines, is that MTN on its own has not done anything wrong. Indeed, it is in order to manage the Nigeria risk that it may have decided, let's become owned by a wider pool of stakeholders to insure ourselves from all these attacks, and it complied with regulatory as far as it was aware. If I suspect there may have been some waivers, but those were granted by regulators, not decided on by MTN. I think the problem is that usually when you go and list in the markets, there's an expectation that some volume of those shares will be available. Now, this is a highly valued stock, maybe comparable only to Dangote in the Nigerian equities market, and arguably perhaps even higher valued, given that this is telecoms rather than manufacturing. So everybody wants that stock, but those who own it don't want to part with it. Indeed. And you can't compel them to sell, unfortunately. So this is highly valued. The pool of MTN investors are not retail cash-trapped investors. They're people who are knowledgeable, who are reasonably wealthy. So they have no compelling reason to sell. Everybody believes there's still value in the stock. So there's no liquidity, and that creates concerns for many in the investment community. But I wouldn't see, I've looked at the issue, I can't see what MTN itself has done wrong. It's investors who take decisions whether to sell their shares, and you can't compel the company to increase its capital if it doesn't have need for investment capital.
Indeed.
So we just have to, I would just caution our regulators, let's not scare away other investors. The company has done a good thing by wanting to list on Nigeria's market. It has reasonably widened and deepened our capital market. Over time, it will have its corporate ups and downs, and investors will choose when to buy and sell, but we shouldn't panic, because at this critical point in time, when investors think there's still value in the stock, nobody's selling.
Indeed, not just the stock, but the Nigerian market itself. After all, MTN could have gone elsewhere. We saw what online retailer Jumia did, despite the fact that it has a ready pool of the domestic market here in Nigeria. And pretty interesting that you mentioned the word the scaring them away, and it was criticized for that, but they also mentioned why they did that, went to the New York Stock Exchange to do the listing there. Very good. Now, what needs to change for key areas for faster growth, and what are the prospects for policymakers here? They are the key decision makers, so what do you make of that?
My biggest hope is that first, at the level of fundamentals, we make a decision in this Buhari 2.0 that we want growth. We want economic growth. We want widespread growth. And we want to stimulate employment and reduce poverty. And we recognize that can, given our current economic and fiscal situation, that can largely come from private capital.
All right.
And of course, both domestic, but also largely resident outside the country. If we make decisions at that fundamental level, on that trajectory, and if those decisions, I caution, we shouldn't write documents without ensuring the complete buy-in of the key people, the president himself. So I don't want policy statements that will be on paper.
Yeah.
But if we get the president and the chief of staff and the vice president and all the key people to 100% buy into that track that I've just described, those fundamental assumptions around where we want policy to go, then it can lead to details such as, for instance, deregulating your downstream petroleum sector.
Indeed.
That will get investment into that sector. We have a huge infrastructure deficit, but we're also an attractive market for infrastructure capital, given all I've heard from investors. So all we need to do is to make the policy environment available, attractive for private capital, much of it international, in infrastructure.
Very good. Where does legislation actually come in here as well?
I think much of our problem is not around legislation. It's around policy. It's around exchange rates. Investors want... we've done a lot to solve the problem through the CBN other market, which is close to market, but we need to eliminate that gap and have a rational exchange rate system that investors don't lose or think they lose a little bit, no matter how small, from official currency rates. So investors want to see an exchange rate that is rational, predictable, and that is market-driven. And we need to do that. We need to deregulate markets. For instance, power. We keep complaining about the issue around power, but we expect investors not to be rational. And I say that because we all know that our tariffs in the sector do not reflect the economic cost.
Indeed.
So we expect investors to be rational because investors are rational. They're not going to invest, at least significantly, in a sector in which they don't make profits. So we need to do all of those. At the end of the day, the fundamental decision we have to make is that we're going to allow markets to work as much as possible. Yes, we recognize exceptions in case of grave national issues. But by and large, most times, except in exceptional cases, we will allow private capital to thrive, we'll allow markets to work, we'll focus on growing this economy through capital.
Agbaje is still with us. Good to have you. Let's talk about the issue of diversification, power problems, manufacturing. What has government been doing on this over time?
Well, first, let me take off from the GDP data we just spoke about. Look at manufacturing growth in Q1, I think less than 1%. Generally, you see a pattern in which those sectors that can employ Nigerians, that can create widespread prosperity and jobs, are doing badly. Yeah, we have some recovery in some sectors, but it's not driven from those sectors that affect many people. Having said that, so the issue of diversification, we mouth it, and we've done so, like you said, at some point, for decades. And more recently, the whole thrust of the economic recovery and growth plan is how to diversify this economy. And that's imperative for policy. Let me make one clarification. So we have a reasonably diversified GDP structure. If you look at our growth, our production, we have agriculture to around 20%. We have trade around 17%. We have manufacturing around 10%. Oil and gas around 10, 11%. We have real estate, 7%. So we have about 7 major sectors that give us about 60% or so of our growth. So it's not that concentrated. The challenge for policy is the 2 areas in which we're not diversified at all.
Okay.
And that's exports, which leads to our foreign currency earnings. And we have oil and gas doing recently lower, maybe 75%, but historically around 95% of our exports, and therefore our foreign currency earnings. And that's why we have severe problems anytime we have problems with the oil and gas sector. It's the same thing with government revenue, which is 75% provided by the oil sector again. So the real policy challenge, yes, to optimize GDP, production, grow solid minerals, improve productivity in agriculture, improve productivity in trade, retail, improve domestic contribution to trade and all of that. But the real policy challenge with diversification is diversifying our exports.
Okay.
So how do we get our agricultural sector to be more competitive globally? How do we get our manufacturing sector to be more competitive globally? How do we process the output of our agriculture and export processed agricultural goods? Yeah. How do we...
So you can compete with
internationally.
internationally.
So it's an issue of competitiveness from that export challenge. And you must remember that Nigerian farms already start with, I don't know, maybe it looks like something you call one leg tied behind the back. One of those races you used to see in children's school.
Although we've been seeing some, well, I wouldn't call it a bit of dynamism in terms of government trying to resuscitate the fortunes of the agricultural sector.
Absolutely. There's policy focus on agriculture. You can't deny that. There's a strong policy focus on agriculture. What I fear is that conflict, which is not an economic, which is we don't think enough about it, but conflicts across the country are affecting agricultural output. So while there's a policy focus on it, while there's a lot of rhetoric around it, we don't see it in the data that, I mean, agricultural growth rates have not been fantastic. GDP Q1 is 3% growth in agriculture. Before then, poorer. If you look at most quarters in 2018, now 1.19, 1.9. That last quarter was the best in 2019.
All right.
I mean 2018. And that's Q4 2018, and it was around 2% growth. So, and you also see a correlation in the inflation data relating to food.
All right.
You see that food inflation still is significant. While the overall inflation rate is around 11, food inflation is often around 15%. So those two data sets tell me that while we have a lot of policy focus in agriculture, we're not talking enough about the impact of conflicts in our agricultural food, our food production zones, the North Central, the Northeast, the Northwest, and even increasingly in parts of the Southwest and Southeast as well. We don't talk sufficiently and we don't analyze sufficiently the impact of all these conflicts that we see across the country on food production. And so there could be a reasonable issue, a reasonable chance if we don't reverse those, that we could even threaten current productivity in agriculture.
Very good.
The other thing is what one-time Minister for Agriculture spent a long time talking about, the value chain development.
All right.
So it's not just about food production, but how do we develop the value chain around agriculture so that there's processing, there's storage, there's the logistics and transportation, market information, all of those factors that make for seamless value addition in agriculture. We need to sustain the work on those issues. So while there's a lot of rhetoric, and then take the other sectors, so the non-oil sectors, power is significant for manufacturing growth.
Indeed.
But the other point is that we also find, so that's a supply side issue, but we also find a significant demand side issue. Poverty, low purchasing power of our consumers. So in spite of all the investments people have made in manufacturing capacity across the country, you find that the consumers are poor and can't take it up. So the growth from the companies in the sector do not reflect the investments they've made. So again, we have to achieve strong growth, 7%, 10%, so that we can rebuild prosperity among our people, reduce unemployment and poverty, so that there will be consumption.
Indeed.
So those are some of the factors we have to work on, or else we're going to be talking diversification and we won't be seeing the output.
Indeed, very good. Now, let's talk about some specifics here. The small and medium enterprises sector. How can this sector be energized? Because if we see in other, advanced economies, that is the base, the foundation of where they are.
Even in Nigeria, the data suggests that a large portion of GDP, certainly not less than, I think the last time I saw those figures, was around 50% of GDP, and a larger percentage of employment is generated by SMEs. So if you see the country having economic challenges, that means our SMEs have economic challenges. I think that we've done more than enough diagnosis in the country around the issues regarding SMEs or even MSMEs. We've done enough. If you call any expert on MSMEs, the diagnoses are clear. Access to finance, logistics, cost of doing business, education, do all of those small bits that impede the growth of small business. But the biggest factor is that you need to have stronger levels of economic growth. A rising tide lifts all boats is what that saying used to be. MSMEs are the most vulnerable. And so when you're growing your economy at 2%, they're the ones who first die off. While the bigger firms are struggling, then MSMEs, in an environment in which inflation is 11%, but growth is 2%, they're more vulnerable, and therefore any small threat to the lifestyle of that person, a small illness, small bereavement, the death of a spouse, the school fees for a child, and they're wiped out. And it takes another year or two before that person revives. So we need to create a better economic environment and lower their cost of operation, power, markets, transportation, logistics, all of those issues. And then, of course, easier access to finance.
Very good. Now, in other issues, the foreign exchange policy of the CBN currently, is it worth it? Are investors buying into it?
Well, I think that investors are generally happier today than they were 2 years ago.
So there's a measure of stabilization?
There's a measure of stability.
All right.
The rates are stable.
All right.
The investors and exporters window provides a close-to-market window for you to access foreign exchange. And it's predictable that when you want to repatriate your exports, if you're a foreign entity, you can. When you want to source inputs, you can. For new investors, however, that's prospective investors who are looking anew at the country, there's still an issue because you still have a 60 naira gap between, by and large, or some, maybe not as large as 60 naira anymore, but some decent gap between what you believe to be market and the rates you get on those markets. And government still has an official rate of 305. So you still need to make, it's no longer a big call for government to harmonize those things. It's no longer a big call. When those gaps were 200 naira to $1, you could understand a reluctance to embrace it. But now it's a narrower gap. And I think the imperative of policy is that we eliminate disparities in our FX market and have a single, rational, market-driven exchange rate.
Indeed.
Fortunately, unfortunately, however, I think the signal that we have is that the current policies may continue, and therefore investors may have to live with the current dual or multiple situation.
Well, hopefully we'll get some spicing up of the policy process and get things moving, as it were. On that note, Opeyemi Agbaje, CEO, RTC Advisory Services Limited, I'd like to thank you for coming to the program. A pleasure to have you. Thank you.
Very much.